I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning to those of you on the West Coast. Welcome to our Nonprofit Advisory Board webinar today entitled Office Lease Challenges During and After the Pandemic, Tips, Strategies, and Pitfalls for Associations and Nonprofit Organizations. My name is Jeff Tenenbaum, Managing Partner of the Tenenbaum Law Group in Washington, D.C., and I will be your moderator for today's program. I'm going to introduce our three panelists in a moment, but wanted to thank you very much for participating in this new season of the Nonprofit Advisory Board's webinar series, hopefully soon to evolve into an in-person seminar series once we're all back to work, so to speak. But for now, we're going to be hosting these in a video webinar format, and I'll give a preview of our next program a little bit later toward the end here. But today's program, I'm excited to be moderating this program and excited to be here with our three panelists who are really true experts in this area, have some terrific insights to share with you. Many of your nonprofit organizations and associations are thinking about and contemplating a return to the workplace. I know because I get asked these questions a lot as a nonprofit and association attorney, particularly about legal risks and obligations of employers in kind of reopening their workplaces. There is increasing pressure in a lot of associations and nonprofits to reopen their workplaces, but there's also a lot of pressure in a lot of organizations, and we're hearing this from our clients as well, to continue to have flexible remote work arrangements for their workforces as well. And this poses some real challenges when a nonprofit organization is stuck with, in many cases, a multi-year lease that has no easy way out of it. Yet the organization may want to very much reduce its footprint, have a more flexible remote work schedule, not need as much office space. Maybe some of our clients have decided to go completely virtual, yet they're still stuck with a multi-year long office lease with no easy way out. So in light of these challenges, and in light of other challenges that nonprofit organizations face in terms of their office leases, we thought it would be a great opportunity to bring three different perspectives to this topic today. We have a terrific real estate broker in Nicole Miller. We have a terrific commercial real estate attorney in Adam Walsh. And we have a terrific CPA and accountant who does a lot of work, focuses her practice on associations and nonprofit organizations, in Jen McCahill. And I'm excited to have them here today. So let me introduce the three of them, and then we're going to get started. First off, I will go in alphabetical order. Jennifer McCahill is a partner at GRF CPAs and Advisors, whose practice and expertise is concentrated in auditing, accounting, and financial management for tax-exempt organizations. She is a frequent speaker on tax-exempt organization-related topics such as common financial challenges, industry trends, accounting best practices, and compliance with the uniform guidance. She leads various seminars and webinars aimed at bringing financial management education to Maryland, DC, and Virginia nonprofit organizations. And I should have said that Jen is based in the DC area. Her firm works with over 700 nonprofits across the US and internationally, of which Jen services close to 150 of those on an annual basis. She's passionate about the nonprofits that are serving our communities and acts as treasurer of Live Baltimore, whose mission is to advocate for the city's development and living. Second, Nicole Miller. For nearly 2 decades, Nicole, tenant broker and senior managing director at Seville's, based in Washington, D.C., has been representing office tenants globally with their real estate and office needs. She works exclusively with tenants who are looking to lease office space, whether to renew, expand, restructure, relocate, or sublease, and/or purchase, sell, or capitalize on build-to-suit opportunities. Nicole specializes in solving the real estate needs of associations, nonprofit organizations, as well as law firms, corporate users, and tech firms throughout office space identification and evaluation, lease and overall business negotiations, along with portfolio optimization. Nicole has executed more than 3 million square feet of record-breaking lease transactions for some prestigious clients, including the American Hospital Association, the American Alliance of Museums, Hogan Lovells, Evershed Sutherland, the Bozzuto Group, and Kimley Horn. She's an award-winning real estate broker and frequently speaks on a variety of real estate topics from the office tenant's perspective, given her exclusive representation of tenants. And last but not least, Adam Walsh is a real estate partner in the law firm of Grossberg, Yokelson, Fox, and Beta, based in Washington, D.C. He has 20 years of experience working with both institutional and entrepreneurial clients in the acquisition, development, structuring, leasing, and financing of commercial real estate projects. The complex transactions that Adam handles include joint venture formations, construction, mezzanine, and permanent loans, ground leases, recapitalizations, and sale leasebacks. He also advises pension funds, real estate advisory groups, real estate investment trusts, and commercial and residential developers. These projects include office buildings, new and converted residential condos, assisted living and other senior housing, and medical facilities, regional and strip shopping centers, and retail and mixed-use developments. He has spearheaded legal teams in closing large multi-state and multi-property acquisitions and dispositions, and has managed commercial finance transactions in nearly all 50 states. Adam he also represents institutional and entrepreneurial landlords in leasing office, retail, and industrial and flex space. So as you can see, we have quite the array of talent to speak to you here today. I'm going to be moderating the program. I'm going to be posing questions to our speakers. No one has any PowerPoint presentations or prepared remarks. We do have certain key points that we're going to try to cover here today, but I will be fielding questions to our speakers, but I encourage you to also field questions through the Q&A box. Post your questions, and I will pose those to our speakers at the appropriate time. And just so you know, my perspective, I've been an attorney in Washington, D.C. for 25 years, exclusively representing associations and other nonprofit organizations, primarily as outside counsel. So that's my vantage point, and certainly have a lot of insight into these issues as well. So to get us started, Nicole, you're up first. Tell us what lease provisions you are seeing to be the most important to have, to be most important given COVID and ultimately moving forward post-COVID.
Sure, Jeff. First, thanks so much for the introduction. In terms of key lease provisions, subleasing provisions, termination provisions, and contraction expansion provisions. So really the name of the game is flexibility. Can't always have all of those, but we want to get as many of those as possible. Certainly during COVID and beyond, a lot of associations and nonprofits are looking at, and we're looking at on their behalf, their subleasing rights to see how friendly or not they are. Ideally, they're pretty open so that we can look at it in any number of sub-tenant possibilities. And then in terms of terminations and contractions, terminations at a later date and time to see, when they could possibly get out of the lease or use that as leverage in terms of renegotiating or moving on from an opportunity. And then just general contraction and expansion opportunities. Perfect case in point is COVID in terms of, we are seeing some that are contracting, we're seeing others that are expanding and de-densifying. So as many opportunities as you have already in the lease is key. But I would say with that, we can work on getting those provisions or talking with the landlord, even if it isn't in your current lease. So know that it's a negotiation, and that's what we do on our clients' behalf to solve for their problems and come up with workable solutions.
Okay, and I'm going to call in a bit to talk about what sort of kind of creative solutions you guys, you and your colleagues are using with your clients to try to get landlords to modify their existing leases. Adam, question for you. Do tenants have additional leverage in new lease negotiations? So not talking about existing leases, but for new lease negotiations compared to pre-COVID?
Short answer is yes. With the recognition that even pre-COVID, it was already what we would call in the industry a tenant's market. And it's even more so now. It's interesting, right before we logged on, when Nicole and I were chatting, we both agreed that we did a webinar similar to this 4 to 6 weeks ago. In that 4 to 6 weeks, velocity in the marketplace has picked up. There are more new leases being done. There's more activity, obvious reasons, vaccine, summer, but it's still very much a tenant's market. There's still a lot of space out there to be leased. So while I think we're past the point where anyone thinks that no one's ever going to sign an office lease again, or even with everyone knowing that there'll be a component of a workforce that works from home or certain people that work from home certain days. There are more new leases getting done now than even just a few months ago. But even with that velocity, to answer your question, the tenants do have more leverage. We are seeing in any of these new leases I'm referring to significant concessions from the landlord, most acutely in what we call the abatement period, which is the time period that even after your new construction is finished and you're occupying, where you're not paying any rent. That's one of the easier concessions for the landlord to give, because even though it costs them income in the short term, by the time they're ready to sell or refinance the building, that abatement is gone and they still have the higher rental rate. So the abatement is really the one to zero in on your lease negotiations, where we've seen that to continue to balloon. But what we call the tenant improvement allowance, which is the amount of dough that they give you to construct your space, those have been healthy as well. But yes, more leverage than before, but there are more leases getting done than before too, which I think is still a good thing for tenants. There is more velocity, more activity, but you still have the upper hand in lease negotiations for sure.
So that's very helpful. Thank you, Adam. You're obviously referring to new leases.
Yes, sir.
For a tenant. Talk for a minute about existing leases. So in your experience, in the last year, even especially in the last few months, that leverage that you talked about that tenants have in a tenant's market, how is that factored into landlords' willingness to make accommodations to tenants' existing leases, whether the tenant is facing financial difficulty and is looking for some sort of rent abatement, or whether it's looking to reduce its footprint, or perhaps even trying to get out of a lease altogether. And I'm going to pose the same question in a minute to Nicole from her perspective.
All right, so let's divide that up. I think if you are a financially healthy tenant that perhaps has more space than you need at the moment for whatever reason, and are willing to commit to the landlord even on a reduced footprint for a longer term, you have a lot of leverage, and landlords will talk to you. Of the leasing work that I have on my desk right now, at least half of it is landlord and tenant getting together to reduce the premises but extend the term. So if you're willing to do that, if you like your building, you know you want to stay long term, you just don't need as much space as you've got right now, it's an excellent time to re-up from a durational standpoint, but shrink from a footprint standpoint. So that's one bucket. The other bucket you mentioned is you're in no position to extend your financial obligations with the landlord, and you've had some financial distress because of COVID and you just need help, right? Whether it's for COVID or any other reason. I think when COVID first hit, landlords were overwhelmed with rent relief requests from the retail sector in their buildings. That's settled out somewhat, but it's still been the sector that's been the most damaged within the office building. Office tenants, the willingness of landlords to kind of quote, cut you a break if you're not extending or recommitting to them. I think the biggest differentiating factor is if you go to the landlord having done your homework. If you're just a tenant and the landlord kind of gets the sense that you're just kind of taking a shot at trying to get something, and you're not going in there with real backup financial information and backup on how your revenue has fallen off, it may fall on deaf ears, or likely to fall on deaf ears. But if you can demonstrate the real financial hardship, you will at least get an audience. I mean, there's no promises, obviously, but I think if you're in that bucket, the key is before you ask for that meeting for the relief, to make sure you can back it up with kind of hard backup as to why it's necessary.
Thanks, Adam. Jen, I'm going to ask you to comment on that for a second. Sorry, I'm not ignoring you. Trying to make sure there's a good flow to these questions. So to Adam's point, have you had the opportunity to work with any of your clients who are facing kind of financial strain, working with them to kind of present their adverse financial picture to landlords in an attempt to secure some kind of relief? And in addition to that, kind of tell us otherwise how you've been working with your clients when it comes to their office leases, how you as an outside CPA have been helping.
Yeah, so definitely going to address a couple things, and one in particular that Adam mentioned on the increase in the abatement and kind of, what the financial implications for a client would be. But before I do that, to your first point and your first question, Jeff, on presenting the nonprofit financials and maybe just pulling the data from the 990, that's something that not only a landlord or a lessor would struggle reading a set of nonprofit financials. This is an ongoing challenge that we constantly are helping our clients with, either third parties, donors, landlords, lessees, to understand when looking at an organization's balance sheet and income statement, what that really means. And they might be used to looking at for-profit financials, whereas nonprofits are very different. So we've absolutely, had an opportunity to rework some of the way that a client is presenting the information on their balance sheet or income statement to tease out and say, yes, it looks like we have a lot of money, but a lot of this money in the nonprofit world is spoken for. It's restricted. So, our grants receivable, our revenues are already spoken for. Our unrestricted position is very different and is telling a different story. So we absolutely have had and seen instances where just some financial education for that landlord is helping clients renegotiate different terms within the lease. The other big thing that I wanted to address, what Adam and Nicole had mentioned thus far, is just the uptick in the rent abatement that we've seen come out of COVID, and the additional free rent that clients are receiving, whether it is under their existing lease, because we've seen landlords be able to provide additional rent abatement under existing leases, or they're going to switch leases altogether. But when you look at that, you always remember that on the cash basis, you're not paying the rent, right? But when it comes to present your financials, because currently under the current standards, the free rent is amortized over the entire life of the lease, you're still going to have rent expense on your books. So although you're not paying rent, you will still be recording 12 months of rent expense under generally accepted accounting principles. So, so that's something that I think surprises clients a lot, or they don't remember to think about that in recording that deferred rent liability, where you're not just taking the free rent in the year that you get it, but you're spreading it out over the life of the lease. So I think that's a really important piece to remember when renegotiating and you're presenting financials to your board, or projected financials to your board, is to consider that there still will be rent expense, not just to reduce the 4 free months that you got this year.
It's very, very helpful. Thanks, Jen. I have a few questions from the audience here, the virtual audience. And this one's either for Adam and or Nicole. In terms of rent abatement, can you put some numbers on how much rent abatement we should expect on new lease negotiations? Obviously, it's going to depend on the lease term, but can you just give some examples of what you guys are seeing, so people have a sense of what might be kind of market norms at the moment?
Sure, I can field that. So in terms of rental abatement, pre-COVID, rule of thumb was about 1 month per year. So for every year of lease term, those approximately, give or take, 1 month of free rent, typically upfront, but we've structured it different ways depending on what clients were looking for. Fast forward, now we could see up to 2 months per year on the high end. So anywhere between the 1 that we had seen before to 2 months per year for the lease term. So really phenomenal rental abatement terms, in addition to huge concession packages with tenant improvement dollars as well.
Interesting. Adam, has that been your kind of experience as well?
Yeah, I would agree with that metric, even though to get up to that 2 months for years, like you're not going to get that if it's like a 1 or 2 year lease. I mean, that metric increases even with the longer term.
Great. Nicole, I'm going to come back to you. So beyond like Adam talked about, the potential to extend your lease term and get some significant concessions, whether it's reducing your footprint, rent abatement, or otherwise. What other kind of tools and tips and strategies have you been using with your clients who are looking for some relief, whether it's to get out of a lease, to reduce their footprint, to sublease in order to reduce their obligations? Tell us some of the things that you've been doing with your clients to help them out in these situations.
Sure. I think, first and foremost, if a tenant wants to stay in the building and wants to figure something out, a good landlord wants to keep that tenant and wants to keep that tenant happy. So from our perspective, when we're advocating and representing the tenant, we want to understand their drivers. What do they want to get out of this? And something that's come to light, in addition to the free rent has been tenant improvement dollars, because now with a return to office or planning for a return to office, they may not want that office to look like it did over a year ago. So what can we do with the landlord to get those improvement dollars? And so restructuring the lease, looking at it to see what we can offer, what the landlord can offer, and come up with viable solutions. I touched on it earlier, but understanding the lease. So is there a termination in there? Are there contraction options? We may not actually want to exercise those, but we want to know where in the timeline those come up, so we have those as leverage, and leveraging those opportunities to get the most value and the most opportunity of what that tenant needs at the current time.
Excellent. Very helpful. I have a question, and I don't want to make this too geographic specific. We have folks from all across the country. But for Adam or Nicole, can you give us a sense of kind of what's the market? Let's just take the DC area where you guys are located and I'm located, and many of our attendees are. Give us a sense of kind of the current market for subleases. So, Nicole, you have a client, a tenant that's looking to reduce their footprint in half, and they're not willing or able to do some of the things that you and Adam have already suggested, but they are looking to sublease. What's your experience as to what's the market like for that?
So subleasing right now is tough. There's a lot of space on the market on a direct basis, as Adam had mentioned, and then all the influx of space that's coming onto the sublease market as well. With that being said, we look at it, and when we're advising our clients, looking at to say, okay, what can we do here? How can we stage this? What does the space look like? The newer, the better. If furniture can be included, that's a plus. Always looking to other related organizations or like-minded organizations. Those seem to be low-hanging fruit, trying to connect the dots to see who can come into the space quickly. And pricing it right is a big key. I know a lot of organizations, wouldn't it be great to get what we're paying? Well, in a sublease market, in a competitive one, we're showing them all the other competitive spaces in their size, in their area, and pricing it right with the thought that you want it to move as quickly as possible.
Adam, any thoughts?
Yeah, I concur with that. If you're a tenant and you're trying to lease your prime space to a subtenant, there's a lot of competition out there. No doubt about it. It's a good time to be a subtenant, quite frankly. But a landlord, if you're going to be going to the landlord looking for concessions, they want to see that you at least tried to sublease. So it's an important process to potentially go through. I mean, and if that dries up, one thing to think about, certainly if you're negotiating a new lease, flexibility in the future, but even if you're under an existing arrangement, is what we're seeing a lot of short of subleases is just a lot of short-term license agreements, sharing of overhead, letting someone use your conference room. You don't put up a wall and necessarily give them signage, but there's can be more flexibility under an existing lease for an arrangement like that, where you're usually not passing through your costs that related to your pro rata share of taxes, insurance, and building operating expenses, but they're at least helping you with respect to a component of the base rent. If you're doing a new lease, you absolutely want to negotiate for the right to license out a certain percentage of your space. But even if you're in an existing arrangement, in the nonprofit world, there's so many organizations with similar missions. And even if it's not necessarily a sister organization, the landlord really isn't going to care necessarily as long as walls aren't going up and there aren't new organizations listed on its directory board. So that could be a step short of finding a true third party, unaffiliated, no connection subtenant, which can be harder. right now.
Great, thank you. Jen, an issue that's near and dear to your heart and mine, UBIT, unrelated business income tax. Some might say, well, what does UBIT have to do with it? Any of this stuff with office leases? Well, as you and I know, it does. So let's take an organization who owns a building or owns a floor, as a condo in a building, and is now subletting space, due to its reduced footprint desires or whatnot. What sort of considerations need to be made there? Talk to us about the UBIT issues. And by that, of course, we're talking about unrelated business income tax. As you probably all know, most tax-exempt organizations are exempt from paying federal and state corporate income tax on most of their income that comes from related activities that further the mission and purposes, and there's lots of different exceptions and exemptions to unrelated business income tax. But there are some instances, and I want you to talk about them, Jen, when some of the revenues that derive in this area from office leases and subleasing and providing services to tenants can give rise to unrelated business income tax. So talk a bit about those and what sort of kind of planning tips do you work with your clients on to help minimize unrelated business income tax?
Yeah, no, and so this one, I'm not going to spend too much time on it because it doesn't come up often, in the situation that a lot of our clients don't necessarily own the buildings, although we have several that do, so it does come across our desk, more than 10% of the time, but definitely, want to make sure we're spending enough time on what the majority of what's going to impact you all out there. But rental income is exempt usually as something that would fall under unrelated business income. However, if you do own a building or own a floor within a building and you decide to reduce your footprint and then go and sublease a portion of your owned building or floor out, if you have debt against that building, so an outstanding mortgage, an outstanding bond issuance, there's a pretty complex calculation in the percentage of square feet that might throw you into that unrelated business income world. So, I would say to that, if you do own a building, if you are renting out a significant amount of that, if you have debt against the building, those are the three yes, yes, and yes, in which you really want to call your CPA, and we want to do some deep dive calculations to make sure that you aren't going to be subject to UBIT. I mean, UBIT happens. You can have UBI. It's fine. We just want to minimize it and make sure it's not impacting your overall federal exemption.
Thank you. We have a question that's probably best posed to me, so I'm going to take a moderator's privilege and answer this question. And I get this a lot these days. Can an employer require that everyone return to the office by a date certain? So I get that question a lot, and I get a related question of, can our nonprofit organization require that all employees be vaccinated before they can return to the office? So it's kind of an interrelated question. You're likely not going to require vaccinations if you're not going to require people to be back in the office or to be traveling for work or whatnot. First off, this is an evolving issue, and we may get more guidance in the future from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But for now, what the EEOC has said on this point is first, yes, if an employer wants to mandate vaccinations for its employees as a precondition to returning to the office or traveling for work, generally speaking, it can, but it has to make exceptions for two cases. One is when an employee has a sincerely held religious belief that argues against vaccination. And two, if an employee has a medical condition or other disability that qualifies as a qualifying disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act or corresponding state laws, then you're going to have to make a reasonable accommodation for that individual, so long as that accommodation still enables them to perform the essential functions of the job, and so long as it doesn't pose an undue burden on the employer. I could spend a lot more time talking about that issue, and I talk about it almost every day with clients, but that's the short answer to the mandatory vaccination issue. I will say that from what we can tell, most nonprofits so far have not decided to adopt a mandatory vaccination policy, but that might change, going forward. I think it's too soon to tell. Now, the related question the question from the audience, can an employer mandate that employees return to the office by a date certain? Again, the short answer is generally yes. There is no protection under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act or other employment laws that say that employees have a right to telework. That just simply doesn't exist. Now, telework has become obviously the norm for most nonprofit organizations during the pandemic. What we're seeing with a lot of our clients is trying to figure out kind of more flexible telework type arrangements, maybe not all full-time, but some of the time moving forward post-pandemic. But there's no legal right to telework. Again, the same legal issues that come into play, like with the Americans with Disabilities Act, if someone, for instance, has a medical condition or disability that does not enable them to get vaccinated, and therefore they don't feel they can come back to the office safely, it's just not possible to create that perfectly safe environment for them. There may be an accommodation that you have to make for that individual, so long as they can still perform the essential functions of their job working remotely, and so long as it doesn't pose an undue burden. But generally speaking, yeah, and some of our clients are planning on mandating a return to the office for their employees, a lot of them focused on right after Labor Day. So that's the short answer to those questions. We have another question from the audience. Do nonprofits that are in DC, based in the DC area, have any chances for relief for their leases on K Street? I don't want to get too specific here on geography. I'm not sure that's going to be as relevant to everyone else, although my office is located on K Street. So I'm not looking for rent relief, but it's an interesting question. But why don't we turn it into kind of a broader question for Adam. So Adam, kind of talk to us about, so in an average office lease, a typical existing office lease, for an association or nonprofit that's dealing with some real financial distress due to COVID or otherwise, what sort of protections are typically built in there for a tenant? And going forward in, whether it's a renegotiated lease or a new lease, what sort of new protections are you seeing tenants try to negotiate into their leases?
Good. So it's been pretty well established even prior to the pandemic, but it's certainly been confirmed in the industry and with a couple of judicial rulings that you're not going to have the ability to just not pay rent under your lease because of the pandemic or some sort of other force majeure cause. That's just not there, unless it was specifically negotiated, which is almost never going to be the case. So in terms of the obligation not to pay rent, you're really not going to be able to find that magic nugget, that magic clause in your existing lease. So look, so what protections are there? I mean, if the protections are that if you can't pay the rent and you vacate the space, if you're in financial distress, the landlord's probably going to resort to its security deposit, and then all it's got is a lawsuit against an organization that if it doesn't have any assets, it may not be worth the lawsuit. But there's no lease protection there. In terms of new leases, I'd say there's two things. When the pandemic first started, there was a little bit of a push that if something else like this happened during the term of your lease, that you would have some sort of relief. And landlords were very amenable to that for retail tenants. A lot of retail leases now, new ones being done, have protections for retail tenants. Something similar to this comes back. Not so much on the office side, because office landlords are smart enough to know that organizations don't necessarily forsake all of their revenue just because they can't come into the building and work. So there are some leases that I've done that if you're flat out prohibited from coming to the office, that some landlords will give you some rent relief, but even there, it's going to be for a limited period of time. They're going to cap the duration of that. And it's almost always going to be tied to not being able to come to the office at all, from being prohibited from working. As we saw with the pandemic, as bad as it was, that really wasn't the case for white collar workers. I mean, lawyers were essential workers in Washington, D.C. So even had we had that provision, we wouldn't have been able to necessarily avail ourselves of it. Now, where you can get relief in new leases is if something like the pandemic or a similar occurrence slows you down on the upfront part of your lease before you can move it. If you can't get a permit, if the permitting office is taking longer to approve your plans, if your contractors aren't able to perform, there'll be some willingness by landlords to grant some what we call tolling of when your rent obligation really starts. That's become almost a matter of course now in what we call work agreements and new leases to give some tenants some relief on kind of the front end. But it's interesting, there hasn't been a sea change on, something like this coming back midterm, protection for office tenants in the future. There were some murmurs when this first hit about whether there'd be a new sort of insurance product the tenants could buy. It would be kind of a business interruption type thing, but that really hasn't gone anywhere. So it's interesting. There hasn't been a real sea change, Jeff, in that dynamic.
And we should note the federal court ruling from yesterday that threw out the CDC's ban on evictions as being beyond the scope of their statutory authority.
Right.
Okay. Back to Nicole. Tell us some of the hot topics you guys have at Seville's a workplace strategies team. Tell us some of the kind of hot topics that you and they have been working on with some of your tenants.
Sure. Along with our workplace strategies team, some of the hot topics, de-densifying. So looking at the plan, if they were in a benching format or a lot of workstations, a lot of open environment, we see some pushback to more offices and putting up different, whether temporary or permanent structures for people to feel more comfortable in those environments, or just removing them altogether. And so that's really been one of the things that I know our team has been looking at, and how to update the planning on that. Returning to work in general, what does that look like? What's it look like when you come into the office? What's the experience? What are the do's and don'ts, and safety and protocols, and how do you make the employees excited about coming back? They've been gone for over a year now, and they've been in the comforts of their home. So, what does that feel, and what does that look like? And I think, also just, the overall, what does it look like moving forward? So, the topics I've been talking about are our current workspaces, but then designing for the future and moving forward, what would that look like when their lease expires and post-COVID?
Thank you. I think segue to preview our next program, the Nonprofit Advisory Board's next program next month, Tuesday, June 22nd, same time, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern, on the same topic. On a part 2, our program's entitled Post-COVID Return to the Workplace, HR and Physical Office Considerations for Nonprofits and Associations. And presumably, if you received an invitation to this program, you will hopefully receive an invitation to the next program, and we do encourage you to participate. Moving on to Jen. So, Jen, when you are changing an existing office lease in terms of rent abatement, cost savings, allocation of expenses based on reduced square footage, what sort of financial statement consideration should nonprofit tenants take into account?
Yeah, so I think we definitely talked about one of the big ones is the abatements, and we're seeing a lot of additional free rent. So if you do have that free rent on your books as the deferment over the course of the lease, we've gotten a lot of questions on, how is that treated? Is it going to be treated as just additional in-kind rent for the year that that you receive it, or should you go ahead and redo your whole deferred rent calculation? And, you know, we've been advising clients to go ahead and redo that deferred rent calculation, which then again takes that and spreads it over the lease. Some of the other things that have come up as clients are renegotiating existing leases, because Jeff, I definitely want to touch on the new standards for new leases at some point. We have several clients that also use square footage as a basis for allocation of expenditures, right? So either not, you're receiving federal or non-federal grant agreements, but you're using office space to allocate costs such as salaries, insurance, related costs and maintenance, things like that. And if you're reducing or completely eliminating and moving to a virtual working environment, you're going to have to rework those cost allocations and come up with a different basis. Obviously, one of the big ones that we typically see is switching to salaries, how people are spending their time. But there are several clients that still use rent and square footage. These 5 people are working on this program and their offices take up this much space of our total master lease. And that's what we're going to use as a basis for the rent allocation, not only with our financial statements that then flows to your 990 and ultimately what you're reporting to your funders. So that's something that has come up, questions on how to relook at that and what that might mean for also your NICRA agreement, should you have to renegotiate that, or how that's being captured. And then the other thing, go ahead.
One point on that, it also, I mean, you're talking about obviously federal grants and contracts and cooperative agreements, and it's critical there for NICRA and other purposes. But in addition, as you know, a lot of your clients and my clients have multiple subsidiaries and affiliates, and often all the staff, is on a common payroll, and they're all in an office that, the lease is by the kind of the parent organization, but then they're allocating costs to the other entities, sometimes based on square footage in their offices. So it definitely can come into play in that as well, in terms of how much reimbursement they're getting from those subsidiaries or affiliates.
Yeah, absolutely. Looking at your intercompany agreements and reworking those, and making sure, it's in no way disadvantaging one organization, should that have any sort of impact on what type that organization, a C3 versus a C6. So Jeff's completely right, making sure that those cost allocations are relooked at and those agreements are reworked. And then I guess the only other thing I'll mention that has come up is some organizations using rent to satisfy the PPP loan requirements. And, should you have free rent, reworking, ensuring that you have enough costs in other areas, such as, salaries and benefits, to be able to utilize those PPP funds if you ultimately do get waiver of some of those rental agreements. So those are some of the things that have come up through these renegotiations.
No, that's a great point. And a lot of associations right now, C6 associations, are in kind of round 2 of the second round of PPP loans, second draw loans, because they were not eligible for the first draw until this year. So we're seeing that as well. I will get back to you on the new lease accounting standards in a minute. We have a question from the audience that I think is probably best directed at Nicole. Nicole, what kind of facility configurations are you seeing in anticipation of return to the office and a more hybrid work world? New facility layouts, technology upgrades, teleconferencing upgrades. Can you give us some examples?
So quick answer is all of the above, but some really detailed data points. So seeing the use of plexiglass, like you see when you're going out to a retailer. So if you have workstations, more traditionally, they've been lower height. They used to be very high, and then we lowered those for visual and connectivity. So now plexiglass in between those workstations, making those workstations larger again, and workspaces. So, we were going kind of shrinking those over time, but again, opening those back up. There are also furniture solutions now that can turn open areas or workstations into small private offices. So think of interior offices. So with a quick furniture solution, at one point you were sitting out in the open, now you're sitting in something that's enclosed and becomes an interior office of sorts. So those are a lot of the updates that we're seeing, at least right now, in adapting with the current spaces that tenants have. And then I'd say for data and for technology, certainly making sure that technology is now in pretty much every space that's there, and that conferencing, it's it's easily accessible and available to all employees, and just making it really seamless in that respect. And then I'd say, in terms of amenity spaces and common areas, again, opening those up, so spreading it out, making it feel like a Starbucks-esque type of feel, so it feels like a welcoming environment, but again, with more placement and larger placement involved, so it's not so close anymore.
Thank you. Adam, so for nonprofits that are engaging in new lease negotiations or even a redoing of their existing lease, what are some kind of new provisions? You touched on some of this already, but what are some additional new provisions that you are kind of recommending to your tenant clients that they try to work into their leases? What do they have? What provisions are they having some success working into the negotiations? Some of these might be, lessons learned from COVID. Some might be unrelated, but in kind of this tenants market that we're seeing, what are some of the kind of new and different lease provisions that you're seeing from a tenant's perspective?
Okay. Well, we talked a lot about space flexibility. One thing we haven't touched on, so I'll use this question as an opportunity to do that, is costs. And what I mean by costs is the cost that it costs the landlord to operate the building. So when everyone who's now getting as a tenant their landlord's reconciliation of what the actual cost to operate the building in 2020 were versus what they estimated, unless the actuals were much less than the estimated, pull out your lease, see if you have the right to audit operating expenses, and give that some serious consideration. Because with the low levels of occupancy, the bottom line was the cost for landlords to clean the building, heat the building, cool the building should have been substantially lower. So what does that mean? So what that means, if you're entering into a new lease, you have got to be doubly sure that if it's what we call a full service lease in the industry, where you're essentially paying your share of expenses over a stipulated kind of base amount of expenses, that base amount of expenses reflects a fully occupied people in their seats building. Otherwise, your base year is going to be too low. And when landlords return to heating, cooling, and cleaning their building all the time, you're going to be paying too much in expenses. So the expense section of your new lease, getting the base year right, having the right to audit operating expenses. A lot of landlords don't like to give that right to audit operating expenses against tenants unless tenants are above a certain square footage. Don't let them do that. Fight for the right to audit no matter what size you are. No doubt about that. Oh, and then caps on what we call controllable expenses. In almost it's always been in every big lease that I've seen, but it's starting to be in moderate leases. And I would push for it even if you're a smaller footprint, that the ability of the landlord to pass through what we call controllable operating expenses, not real estate taxes, usually not insurance, but the stuff that the landlord contracts for on a discretionary basis, the annual increases in those expenses can be capped, usually on a 5-6% year-on-year basis. That's something else in new leases to really zero in.
Those are great suggestions, both for in connection with new leases and existing leases.
Jeff, can I just add to that? One other data point I think that could be helpful, and I know Adam and I have worked on a number of leases where we've gotten this provision. As we see landlords adding in or upgrading fitness centers, conference centers, rooftops, or getting very specific with the square footage, the offerings, the location, and to make sure that that's an amenity, not just now to sell the tenant to come to the building, but that amenity is not going to be leaving. So ensuring that it's there through the lease term and any extensions thereof the lease term. And so, making sure they don't all of a sudden change the fitness center. Used to be 5,000 square feet, now it's half the size, or a rooftop where you planned on having a big conference or cocktail party. Making sure that that's all in place and that it's insured again through the current lease and the extension thereof.
It's a great suggestion. Jen, your favorite topic, the new lease accounting standards that are going to take effect in the next couple of years. What do nonprofit organizations need to consider when renegotiating their lease agreement or entering into new lease agreements under these new standards?
Yeah, so this one's a bear, you know, we could spend a whole hour on the new lease standard in and of itself, but it's by far the biggest overhaul and the biggest change that is going to affect everyone on this call. So, you know, whether you are renegotiating your lease, whether you're still within a multi-year lease, whether you did or did not receive additional concessions, whether you're a nonprofit or for-profit, this is applicable to everyone. And you know, it's been delayed a couple of times. So topic 842, the new lease standard, hopefully everyone's at least heard of it, because it's a complete overhaul of what has been existing, considered off balance sheet operating leases, right? So your office space has never really been capitalized on your balance sheet. And so this new standard aims to kind of take those off balance sheet leases and put them on the books. And so, you know, this was supposed to be applicable a couple of years ago. It got delayed, then it got delayed because of COVID. But ultimately, if you're a December year end, you are required to implement 2021, so the year that you're in. And if you're a fiscal year end, it will be your fiscal year 2022. So this is so extremely timely for the topic, regardless if you're renegotiating. But that will significantly change how you account. You will have a huge right of use asset. So if you're in a multi-year, five years, you're going to discount all of those future payments, present value, and book a right of use asset and an offsetting liability. So your balance sheet is going to look completely different than it has in the past. It'll be grossed up significantly. Where this comes into play when you're looking at your existing leases is making sure that all of the terms and conditions that are in there are really defined. And I know that's something that, you know, Nicole and Adam help you with, but that extends to things such as those leasehold improvements, who owns them, who's going to retain them at the end. There's some really big changes around that, that were traditionally, you know, we're used to capitalizing those leasehold improvements, but that'll be something that you really need to get defined within the lease agreement. The other thing, topic 842, that you really want to consider, if you have any sort of debt, line of credit, maybe a note payable, you know, not the PPP loan, maybe bond covenants, that you do have financial covenants against that debt. We've seen a number of clients, you know, automatically fail those ratios, those covenants, because now they're required to capitalize the asset and liability. So these are things that, as you're renegotiating your lease, you might want to be talking to your CPA to make sure that you understand the financial implications. The only other thing I'll say, because again, we could spend an hour digging into the details on this, but I wanted to cover, I think the very key points is, if you are entering into a new multi-year lease agreement and you're not required to adopt this standard, your CPA is probably going to work with you to early adopt, right? Because if you wait and you don't adopt the standard at the time that you renegotiate a new multi-year lease, you will have to go back and restate your financials to adopt the standard and change your beginning balances anyway. So it's much cleaner to go ahead and adopt this huge new standard at the time that you're entering into a new lease. And so, you know, although it seems far away, if you're renegotiating now, it's now. And so understanding what that's going to look like when you're reporting to your board, what it's going to look like for your bottom line, because you're no longer straight lining those monthly rent payments. You are going to amortize the asset and expense the liability. So it does have a bottom line impact. It will have an impact on your budget. So many things to consider that with this new standard, that you definitely want to talk to your CPA.
Thank you, Jen. Right, in the final kind of 4 minutes we have left, I'm going to reserve 2 for Adam and 2 for Nicole. Title of our program is Tips, Strategies, and Pitfalls for Associations and Nonprofit Organizations with respect to their office lease challenges. So Adam, give us, you know, 1 or 2, if you want, additional tips, strategies, pitfalls that we haven't talked about so far that you'd like to pass on to our audience.
Sure. So if you're doing a new lease, make sure that the landlord's discretion over your ability to sublease isn't what we call off-market. It should be a reasonable standard. And more importantly, landlords like to cordon off certain categories of prospective subtenants from not being fair game. Try not to let them do that unless it's really someone that they've been talking to for very similar space in your building. So not giving the landlord too much discretion. Oh, there's always going to be a level of consent with subtenancies, unless it's just to an affiliated entity. But that's really an area where it's worth the new lease negotiations, zeroing in on for all the reasons we really.
Yeah, you and I have talked about in the past, the issue of some leases making existing tenants of the building off limits in terms of subleasing, and I think that's something you've suggested to try to negotiate away.
You really want to try to resist that because that's always your best pool of potential subtenants. So if you can get existing tenants fair game, unless it's someone that the landlord has been talking to for a similarly sized suite to what you're trying to sublease, consider that a victory.
Thank you. All right, Nicole, you're up and you're going to close us out. Give us one or two tips, strategies, pitfalls that you want to pass on we haven't talked about so far.
Sure, I'll give you two quick tips here. So first, looking at organizations, say 10,000 square feet and below. If you're looking for space out in the market and you want flexibility, we've seen a real rise in interest in what we call a landlord's pre-built suite. So the landlord has spent a lot of money, a lot more than you would want to sink into a space to make it look really nice, move-in ready. And what we're seeing is with some of these spaces, they're even throwing in furniture for an extra $1 per square foot. So you don't even have to worry about the furniture. So it's a counterpoint to co-working, because with the pandemic, you may not want to go into a co-working environment where there's a lot more people, a lot more hustle and bustle, and you want to have your own suite. You can do that with a landlord pre-built suite. And a lot of those were done and built during this last year. So when tenants are back out looking for space, there's a lot of new product to look at. The other thing I would say, just to associations and nonprofits in general, speak with an advisor, figure out the business case and what's most important, because again, there's certain things that are black and white in leases, but there are a lot of things that can be negotiated and talked about, and bouncing it off of us, the three of us, four of us here, talking it through to see if a case can be made. There's a lot of data right now on things that have been done, but I know, we've even been talking about things that haven't been done and now being successful in those efforts. So now's the time to think about something, and if you need it or thinking of restructuring or do something differently, do it now.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you to all three of our panelists, Nicole and Adam, for a terrific presentation. We covered a lot of ground in 60 minutes. I really appreciate all of your terrific insights and your participation. Thank you to all of you for joining us today, and we hope to see you back here next month, June 22nd, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time for our next Nonprofit Advisory Board program. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.